something interesting, and I hope you'll all enjoy and participate and ask questions if you'd like. It's certainly a fascinating topic, and of course, here at our share every morning, we pretty much learn the Parsha. So we're still learning the Parsha. Don't worry about that. I'm not canceling our Parsha discussion, but we're going to take off. We're going to begin looking at last week. Last week, we read the Shema. And guess what? We're going to read the Shema again in this week's Torah portion, except that last week was the first paragraph of the Shema, and this week is the second paragraph of Shema. So if you recall, last week we analyzed a few differences between the two. First one's more individual, the second one's more collective to the entire community. But what does it have to do with the topic that I sent out today about Apocrypha? Jewish Apocrypha? What on earth is going on? So the truth is, I probably didn't allocate enough time, and the more I read and Google and check, and there are sources, there's a lot to discuss. So we're going to dive right into it and try to analyze different Jewish sources, but starting off with what the Torah tells us. Because firstly, we know from a Jewish perspective, we all like learning, we enjoy wisdom. Aren't we the people of the book, right? For thousands of years, Jewish people, we've been studying Torah, we've been studying lots of works, and you look around in academia, I think we're disproportionately a higher number of Jewish people in universities and studying and succeeding and doing well out there. But the Torah, as much as it is the divine wisdom, there's infinite number, I shouldn't say infinite, only God is infinite, but there are thousands, probably millions of books, with commentary on Torah, right? So we don't see the divine wisdom. Obviously, the Torah is the Torah, and we have the 24 books of the Torah, which were canonized, and we're going to discuss that in greater detail just now. But we also apply human wisdom. Most of Jewish law is books that were expounded upon by the great sages of Israel. You look at the Shulchan Aruch, which is the authoritative work of Jewish law. Many of them have, and there have been multiple editions, because as time evolves, we have to apply the ancient laws to contemporary times. So God invites us to involve our minds in God's wisdom. And this is part of what is accomplished by the oral law, that human beings, you and I, study and understand Jewish law, we could participate in Torah. We don't have to just be spectators. We don't passively receive the Torah. In fact, when we say a blessing at an aliyah, what am I saying just on aliyah? Every day we say the blessings for the Torah. In fact, you should probably say the blessing now if you haven't said it this morning. We say, Baruch Atah Hashem, we bless Hashem who chose us to give us the Torah. And what do we say? No saying HaTorah. We don't speak in the past tense that God gave us the Torah. We speak of it in the present tense. So certainly we all could play our role in understanding and learning and analyzing and playing, being part of the Torah, making it real as part of our lives. Just a second. So with that in mind, the thing is, I apologize. I'm not sure why it's jumping to someone else's device. I will spotlight myself. Okay, now all you see is me. That's not the prettiest thing. Okay. Excuse me. Apologies. So now, the thing is, every positive also has within it, naturally, the way God made the world, some kind of implicit negative. And just as we're encouraged to recite the words of Torah and to teach them to our children, as we say in the Shema every day, and it comes from our portion this week, from the Parsha of Ekev, we're warned not to stray from its path. And that's not in the first paragraph of Shema that we read last week, but rather in the second paragraph of Shema. The Torah obligation to learn is not a blanket encouragement of all fields of study. And this is peculiar, you would think. If we're the people of the book, shouldn't we be studying everything out there, right? Accumulate, learn, gain as much knowledge as possible. But it doesn't seem, obviously when it comes to Torah, study, learn, delve into it. And obviously in order to fulfill the command that the Torah says, Vishinantam levanacha v'dibarta bam, you should speak of it to your children, and you should learn it. But when you're at home, when you're going on the road, which is easier than ever today. You pick up your phone and you don't even, you put in your earpods. You could listen to Torah sessions, to lectures anywhere. The podcasts that are available, there's no limit to how much we could study. And we have to know the Torah. It's our obligation. In today's day and age, I don't think there's an excuse for anybody to say that they don't know, because you can't say ignorance is bliss anymore. Once upon a time, we didn't have books. We'll get back to that in a moment. But in today's day and age, there's absolutely no excuse or reason why a person can't study, other than our own, perhaps, I don't want to say laziness or ignorance, but ignorance today, in today's era. But there are limits to that from a Jewish perspective. And I know you're wondering, what limits on learning? Yes, that's what we're going to talk about. And we have to make a very important distinction between the correct and incorrect path that the Torah tells us to follow. And we say this in our Shema every single day. It's in our portion this week. The Torah, there's a verse. I'm sorry, I didn't put the texts into today's slides. I have a very few slides today. A lot going on, less time to put slides together, apologies. But the Torah says, Hishamru lachem pen yifta levavchem. You should be very careful in case your heart is seduced away. V'sartem v'avadetem elokim acherim. And we wind up deviating to worship other gods. That's in the Shema. It's in our Parsha this week. So there's a general prohibition in our Parsha of allowing our heart to be seduced away from Torah. Because this could lead to even worse, as we say in the Shema, v'ishtachavisem lahem, that it might cause us to worship idols, to betray God. And the Torah tells us, and we're going to get to the next week's Parsha, where we learn all the prohibitions against worshiping idols and foreign gods and all that, polygamy. We shouldn't, when we come to the land of Israel, think that we're going to be influenced by the people who already exist there and be curious about their ways of life. No, we have a Jewish way of life. There's nothing wrong with being aware of the other ways, especially when we have to know what not to do. So this is, in our Parsha, a prohibition against being lured away and inquiring about other religions and learning from idol worship. By the way, of all religions, interestingly, which one could you say is probably the most similar to Judaism? And there's no problem with going into their houses of worship to pray, would be Islam. Yeah, that the Islamic religion is most similar to Judaism in that sense, and they do not believe in polygamy. Whereas a church would be problematic for a Jew to go into. Worse yet would be, I was in India, going into an ashram. And unfortunately, I could tell you many, many Jewish people sadly get stuck in the ashrams. And I've heard stories even directly from, what do they call him? Not the imam, what's the name of the guy who runs the ashram, the guru. And I've heard stories from them, how Jewish people wind up there and sometimes how they send them even back. There's a famous story about the Dalai Lama, how he made a shidduch when a young Jewish guy wound up in his ashram there in Tibet. And the Dalai Lama sends him off to Israel, says, have you ever even explored your own religion before you coming to mine? He said, no, I grew up in Israel. I don't know anything about Judaism. It's antiquated, it's outdated. I'm not familiar with it. He said, no, you don't understand your religion. Go back to Israel, study your religion, and once you know enough, then perhaps you could come see me. And eventually he went to Israel, studied at a yeshiva, and decided, well, actually, Judaism is beautiful. I can't believe I missed this all my life. And so he's introduced to a young lady who had a very similar story, so their shidduch is attributed to the Dalai Lama. Anyways, I want to make one more comment about people who say they're atheists. I was reading last night, I don't know why, you get stuck. This is the problem with our devices. They could be very good. We can learn a lot more these days than ever before, but it could also somehow keep us distracted from things we got to do. So I wound up late at night sometimes reading or watching some videos. Last night I was watching Jeff Bezos. I was quite fascinated by him. Watched a few interesting videos of Jeff Bezos, who was for a while the richest man in the world. He was describing, in the 1990s, in 94, he started Amazon.com. And it's fascinating to hear his story. And then I wound up on one about Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg famously brought to the world Facebook. And, from there came all the social media apps that we're using these days right here. We're being broadcast right now on Facebook. So people are watching us here. How's it, guys? And Mark Zuckerberg is Jewish. And he was a self-proclaimed atheist for some time. But he says, I've learned otherwise, and I've come to appreciate religion and God. What's very interesting to me when I was reading that about Mark Zuckerberg yesterday is that Mark, and not just Mark, anyone, oftentimes people are self-professed atheists. They don't believe in God. And I can understand that sometimes being an atheist is not so attractive. It's a non-profit business, right? But the other thing about atheism is I'm reminded of the words of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berditchev. Somebody once said to him, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. And the rabbi responded to him, the God that you don't believe in, I don't believe in that God either. And what he was saying essentially is your perception of God. Yesterday we talked about this in yesterday's shir, that oftentimes it's our own perception of things that is just wrong, that we perhaps haven't learned correctly or haven't delved deeper into it. Sometimes people have a perception of God, like I concluded yesterday's class, for those who were here then, about the story about a Holocaust survivor who went to meet his rabbi. And his rabbi also lost family members and 250,000 of his followers, the Ger Rebbe from Israel, today in Israel, but originally from Gur, which is a city somewhere in Eastern Europe. And the man said to his rabbi that, if God could behave like this, if God could allow such an atrocity, the murder of so many innocent people, I can't believe in this God. And the man had a point, and the rabbi, of course, responded by explaining to him that from our parsha, how Moshe Rabbeinu smashes the tablets only le'neim to your eyes, meaning to say that from our perception, the tablets were smashed. But this rabbi says there's a place in which the tablets remain whole and complete, and there's a place in which your family members who sadly were murdered by the Nazis, also, they remain untouched, they remain unscathed. That's, of course, a much deeper level. Oftentimes, it's our own perception that perhaps adulterates things, that just gives us a different way of perspective that's not necessarily the correct way of seeing things. So, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Raditchev was saying to this person who says, I'm an atheist, he said, don't worry, your perception of God, I don't believe in that kind of a God either. To think that God is evil, that God is going to allow atrocities, we have a limited understanding of God. And from that perspective, I don't believe in that God either. But what I do want to look at here is the ban in our parsha, in the Shema, which says very clearly, that we should not go astray, that we should not consider this verse and tell us. So when we consider the full context of Jewish law, the prohibition is not just don't go astray and worship other gods. It actually gets deeper than that. It's broader, and it establishes well-defined limits on what we are allowed to learn. Yeah? Now, I know that doesn't jibe very well with today's day and age. What do you mean? I learn what I want to learn, right? I read and watch and do what I want to do. Aren't we in the modern era? Well, let me take you into Maimonides. Let me just pick up the text here. Maimonides, in his codification of Jewish law, the Rambam, he groups both sources from our parsha. Remember, we had Shema last week and this week. And in next week's parsha, we learned the prohibition of learning from, being influenced by the neighbors, by the people in Israel who were there before us, who were pagan idol worshippers. And let me just read the law to you very briefly, just a synopsis of it, just so you understand where this idea comes from. And Rambam says, idol worshippers wrote many books about their worship, how it is performed, its actions, and its laws. This is in Maimonides' work on the laws of Oivdei Kechavim Umazelos, the laws of idol worship, and constellations, because of course there are people out there who give credit to the constellations, to the stars, to the sun, to the moon, to all these other aspects of attributing them as deities in creation of the world, a kind of a partnership, which is part of Judaism's problems with Christianity, where there's a Trinity. It reminds me of a good old joke of a Jewish kid who used to go to, he wasn't doing very well in the cheder, his grades weren't so well, particularly when it came to maths. So the parents sent him to a Catholic school. Oh, there he was doing well. And King David, not so well, and King Edward or whatever, he was doing fantastic. They asked him, what's going on? He says, well, when I saw that person stuck to the plus symbol, I knew they're serious about maths in this place. But then as he was coming home and telling his parents a little bit about the Trinity, about the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, now his parents started getting serious with him. His father picks him up. His parents were shtuckle atheists. So they pick him up by the collar. They said, listen here, boyki, there's only one God and we don't believe in him. Stop telling us about the Trinity. But the Trinity, in essence, is against Jewish belief. Okay, because it is saying that God is not in total control. Perhaps God created the world, but then God has assistance in creation of the world. That's against Jewish belief. Okay, so we're going to have to go through and understand a little bit of what beliefs that Judaism disdains. And one of them, let me continue reading to you from the words of Rambam. He tells us, the Holy One, blessed be HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God commanded us not to read such books at all, not to think about them or any of their words. Even to look at the appearance of forms of idols is forbidden. As the verse in our parsha says, not to look, not to go after idols. So, again, here you're seeing the commentaries. This is the oral law explaining the Torah. Maimonides making it very clear that we are forbidden from following the ways of the pagan idol worshippers. And he continues. It's about this that the verse says, in case you'll ask after their gods. If you're a curious George, right? How did those nations serve their gods? Just curious, just want to know. This is forbidden, even though you aren't even serving the idols, since it causes one to turn after them and to do as they do, as it says, that you'll do the same. In our parsha, right? If you're going to wind up being curious and learning, I personally, there's so much about Judaism I need to know. Now I'm going to start learning about other religions. If I'm a rabbi, I think I got to spend my time learning about Judaism. This doesn't mean we're not aware of other religions and understanding a little bit about it, but that's not our business to start going into and dissecting and analyzing and learning their ways. So here's the thing, that the verse says, based on our commentaries, that the Torah bans studying works of idol worship, so we will not become influenced, indoctrinated by their ways. Very simple. The prohibition of studying idolatrous works is a subset of the laws that forbid turning to idols, even to learn from them, which is part of the Ten Commandments, right? Not to worship any other god. So that's the beginning of it. But the forbidden areas of study are not limited just to idol worship or about their practices. They're ultimately defined not by the author of the work, but by the subject matter. And they include not just idol worship, but other forms of heresy as well that are forbidden from a Jewish perspective. So, what's considered heresy? Let me continue reading to you from the words of Rambam. Right? We want to know what is considered heretical study. That's what you're wondering? Well, let me share with you more about what Rambam says. Okay? What's considered heretical study? Says the Rambam, it is not idol worship alone to which one is forbidden to turn, but any thought that causes one to uproot one of the fundamentals of Torah. We are prohibited from bringing such thoughts to mind, paying attention to them, or allowing our hearts to be drawn after them. Human understanding is limited. Not everyone is able to grasp the truth clearly. If one follows the limited understanding of one's mind, one can come to destroy the world through one's ignorance. We discussed this idea also previously. For example, I said the Nazis, the Germans were very enlightened and cultured people, yet they were able to come to commit the atrocities they did, the murder of millions and millions of innocent human beings, a third of our people, and so many innocent others. How were they able to come to that? Because it wasn't just divine wisdom. Some of them were very religious Christians. How is it possible then that they could violate and transgress the Torah laws if they believe in it? Because it became interpreted by their own mind. And therefore we say, even the laws that make sense to us, even those that are rational, we still have to see it from a super rational perspective, in a way that transcends our limited understanding. Because if God said so, we follow God's laws regardless of what I understand. Let me just read for you a little bit more of Rambam. He says, for example, a person sometimes strays after idol worship, but sometimes thinks about God's unity. Perhaps he's one, perhaps not. Now, you and I, we're not living in places where there are ashrams and where we're being exposed to idol worship. But Rambam's point is actually relevant to all times. He's saying that this idea that we get exposed to these understandings, these teachings, they cause us to question. Questioning is not forbidden in Judaism. Remember, we question all the time. It's the best way to learn is asking questions. We have the 4 questions in Manishtana on the Seder, and many more questions. Judaism is filled with questions all the time. But what he's mentioning to us that's strictly forbidden is when the questions are coming from our inquisitiveness about another, especially an idolatrous religion. One wonders what is above and what is below. What is before, what is after? Sometimes about prophecy. Perhaps it's true, perhaps it isn't. Sometimes about Torah. Perhaps it's divine, perhaps it's not. So Rambam is warning us against the inquisitiveness about idolatrous religions. He said if one doesn't know the right traits that will bring him to the clear truth, they could fall into heresy. This is what the Torah warned about when it said, do not stray after your eyes and after, right? We say this in Shema, do not stray after your heart's desires and after your eyes that lead you to morality. That is to say, you should not be led after your limited understanding and think that you've grasped, that you understand the Torah, and now you're not vulnerable to any negative influences. The sages said, what does it mean, acharei levavachem, after your hearts? This refers to heresy. What does it say, after your eyes? This refers to immorality. And that's why, indeed, we have to have some self-control in the world. It's interesting and fascinating to me to see that during the current Olympics, there was a movement of women in Tokyo who insisted on going in full garb for certain athletic exercises, because they felt they were being subjected to sexuality, that they were just becoming, and this is not coming from Torah, from tznius, from laws of modesty. This is coming from people feeling that they were being sexualized. So just interestingly here, coming from Maimonides' words, what do we see? What is Maimonides telling us? Any knowledge that can lead us away from Torah is forbidden. Okay, we're not only forbidden to study the works of idol worship per se, but any knowledge that can lead us away from Torah. And the Rambam writes that it is wrong for one to follow our own mind on matters of great philosophical and theological importance. And therefore he mentions the unity of God, or the truth of the Torah. He says, not everybody has the intellectual capacity to understand these matters so clearly. You really have to delve deep into understanding the Torah. And another point that he made very clear was the danger of such study. He says it could literally, his words, I read it to you a second ago, he said to destroy the world. That's quite harsh, right? It could destroy the world. And I'll make it even worse yet, just to make it a little bit more interesting. Maimonides himself studied theology and philosophy, studied Aristotle and others, so he obviously was entitled to speak this way. He studied it, and he says, don't study those things. Now, what's the reason he studied it? We'll get more into that just now. But he studied it to know what to answer the heretics who are familiar with those teachings, and to tell them why it's wrong and how it's wrong. There were times in history when, for example, we have a video here at Chabad House called The Disputation. Some of you may have seen it. I showed it here at Chabad House a number of years ago. It's the story of the Vikuach HaRamban, the great debate between the Ramban, Nachmanides, and a famous Jewish apostate by the name of Pablo Cristiani. Pablo Cristiani was a Jewish troublemaker who sadly, although he was born Jewish and raised religious, caused a lot of trouble for Nachmanides in Spain. He was a convert to Christianity and caused Jewish people more trouble than some notorious anti-Semites in history. So the Vikuach HaRamban, that disputation between Rambam and Pablo Cristiani, was published in a book called Vikuach HaRamban, but it was also produced as a film by BBC. We have the video here at Chabad. I hope that by now they've made an updated version that's available on YouTube or something. Netflix, who knows? But the video we have here, and just interesting to see what they put him through. And then at the end, even though he won the debate, but he embarrassed the church. So Nachmanides was exiled, was banned from Spain. He had to leave the Iberian Peninsula, and he goes to Israel where he passes on. But he served, I think, as the rabbi in the community there for a number of years before. So the point I'm making is that... we're going to have a little bit of trouble here. Hold on a second. Ladies and gents, give me a minute. Let me just reshare my screen. I have to fix up my computers. My computer's... Okay, apologies. All right, sorry. Computer giving me a little bit of trouble here, but sorted for now. So the point I'm making is that Maimonides says not even to engage in debate, in disputes with heretics. Now the thing is that, reading back in these words, Rambam says, to study what's above, what's below. Obviously, if a person's interested and wants to know, you want to study, you want to learn, you want to try to get into it, right? But what he's saying is that this verse is telling us, he's comparing, first they say, don't go astray after your heart, which he says, he compares it to heresy. And then, and then after your eyes, which is sexual immorality. He's comparing the two. Very interesting comparison. So, just to read to you a few words, this is from the Talmud. It says, heresy is an important matter that a person must distance from his heart, not allowing it even into his thoughts. The Torah warns us about it more than all other transgressions. As the Torah says, the sages explain what does it mean after your heart, right? After your heresy and sexual morality. Says the Talmud, every evil system of thought or apostasy is included in heresy. And all of the transgressions deriving from lusts are included in immorality. So he's telling us that we have both of these categories that are forbidden for Jewish people. He says, therefore, we are forbidden from both of these. Okay, so he's telling us that, but heresy comes before immorality. Sexual immorality is between husband and wife, or between, it's an interpersonal matter. Of course, it's abominable to God as well. But heresy is even worse than sexual immorality. Now, we talked in Monday's class, can we prioritize? Can we give precedence to one law, to one mitzvah over another, to one prohibition over another? The prohibition against studying heresy is quite serious. As we see, it's forbidden in Shema, and our sages tell us. It's so serious, in fact, that our sages tell us studying anything that may lead to heresy. That's what the Talmud says, which leads us to wonder, of course, then how could Rambam himself go on and study this, right? In fact, he wrote a book called Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, and he explores in it these theological, philosophical matters, and he quotes in it Aristotle and other great philosophers of that time. I haven't studied it myself very well to quote them to you, but the point is he not breaking the same rule that he says? And I don't think it is a matter of cognitive dissonance. The dentist who's giving my kids sweets, even though the dentist is saying to the kids that you have to look after your teeth. Right? Because the dentist wants to be a nice, good guy that the kids are going to like. Or the doctor who says smoking is bad yet smokes themselves. Rambam had obviously a different reason for it. Is that his reason was simply to know how to answer the heretics. In order for Nachmanides to stand up there in that disputation and engage with Pablo Cristiane, he had to know how to answer his questions. So here it is in Rambam's words. He says, the famous works of natural philosophy are not godly, and it is appropriate to avoid them if they endeavor to uproot the main truths of Torah. Specifically, they undermine the two fundamental pillars of Judaism. That is, that the world was created and that God exerts providence over the lives of individual human beings. So the main issues the Talmud is telling us that are problematic are these two fundamentals. That the world was created. It seems that the perspective then was, no, the world is an ongoing matter. And secondly, that God is involved in our life. Many people say, okay, even if you believe that God created the world, but God is up there, God's far away, or God let it go. And we say, no, God's involved in every detail and aspect of our lives. It's called hashgacha pratis, individual divine providence. And so the Talmud says, the philosophers of that time, they cite proofs and examples that in their opinion demonstrate that the world has existed forever, and that God must necessarily create the world as it is, just as light naturally flows from the sun, and a tree naturally casts a shadow. The philosophical perspective then was, the world just existed. They argue that God cannot alter nature in any way, and cannot lengthen the wing of the fly, or shorten the leg of the ant, just as the sun cannot change its own light, or the tree its own shadow. They argue further that God's providence does not extend to below the sphere of the moon. So again, these are reasons why great sages learned what they have to say and debated, disputed it. Just another point from the Talmud. They write in their works that no knowledge is perfect except that of philosophy, not even revelation. However, we Jews are the receivers of the revealed truth, and our position is that our Torah is perfect and was revealed to the assembly at Mount Sinai from the mouth of God himself, and through the master of the prophets. The Torah stands above all, and all philosophies are emptiness and chaos in comparison. This is what our sages in the Talmud have to say. And of course, the Talmud has many sharp statements about the philosophers of that time. Rambam himself, using him as the example, and I'll get back to a few insights from Rambam in a moment, Rambam had some, he demonstrated a very famous story. We was debating with philosophers and saying that everything is created according to the will of God. And the philosophers of that time were trying to prove how they could change nature. It's not in God's hands, so to say. So they had a competition where they trained cats to be the waiters, to be the ones serving the food at this function. And in fact, the cats were very well dressed. They were wearing tuxedos and white gloves. They looked good with bow ties. And these cats came out of the kitchen all holding platters in their hands. And they're like, Rambam, how are you going to disprove us? And he said, very simple. He opened his little snuff box. He had a little box with him. He opens the box, and out of the box, he lets out a little mouse. And as the mouse jumped from the box, the cats dropped their platters and ran after the mouse. And with that, Rambam said, you see, you can train a cat. You can do all you can. But at the end of the day, the cat is created the way God made it. God made it, the cats run after mice, and that's just the nature of a cat. So yes, we can train it, but we're not going to change its nature the way God made them. So the thing is, as we're seeing, the problem with some forms of knowledge is that they contradict the knowledge that we study in Torah. That's the first issue we have with some of these things. Okay, and now, for example, that the Talmud mentions the philosophers who claim that the world existed forever and that God is not involved and engaged in our daily life, right? So that is contrary to the Torah's way. So the Talmud is saying, since we have access to divine wisdom, to the Torah, we should engage in Torah study. And furthermore, he says if there's a situation in which we can only be brought closer to the truth of Torah through philosophy, then in that instance, that's where the great sages said it's okay for them to study the philosophies just to know how to answer the heretic. So it's only because the Rambam himself was a master of Torah study, and not just Rambam, other great sages. That's why they felt that they can engage in those philosophical teachings in order to understand what their teachings are and to know how to debate them, so that that they're sharing the Torah's perspective to those who are otherwise unconvinced. So the basic idea we're saying here is that works of philosophy that are contrary to Torah's principles could lead us astray. And this is especially true if the works were written by idol worshippers, or are trying to justify idol worship or polygamy. But not polygamy, sorry. Come on, what is it called? Polygamy is the second set of what the Shema says. Polytheism, that's the word I'm looking for. Okay. Now, here's an interesting thing. We have something called Apocrypha, or I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it. It's a nice Google word. It's actually a Latin or a Greek word. And what is exactly this Apocrypha? So these are books, if you Google it, it's going to tell you esoteric works or, sublime kind of information only known by some. It's also works that were not included in the what is it called? Come on, we used that word earlier. The general inclusion of Torah study, okay? So what is it with these works? And I'm not only talking about forbidden idol works. I'm talking about even Jewish works, okay? And these are called Sfarim Chitzonim, external literature or Apocrypha, okay? So it's, again, this is a Latin or Greek word that's hidden away, or it refers to secret, that's the word I'm looking for, canonized, right? Not included in the canon of Torah. So we're talking about ancient Jewish works that are not part of Tanakh. Now, you might not even be familiar with them, and I myself wasn't, except in preparation for today's class, and I'll share some of them with you. I wrote them down for myself to share with you what they are. But some of these works have been available since they were written, long ago. Some of them were recently found, actually. For example, one of the works, here's a few of them. One is called Ben Sira. Ben Sira, there's a Greek translation, which was made into English as well. And that is not part of Torah. That's one of the forbidden works. They were recently found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So when I was last in Israel, which was about 3 years ago, a little bit more, we went to an area in Israel, and the name of the area just skips my mind. I forget what it's called. But it's basically somewhere in the Jordan Valley, close to the Dead Sea. And that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Okay? And many ancient texts were found there. So
Qumran.
The English or translation, which is based on the Greek translation, was available to people, anyone who wanted to study these works for a very long time. But the Hebrew work, the original, was only found very recently. There was another finding of works called the Cairo Geniza. Okay, that was in Egypt, where many ancient Hebrew works were found. So here you have a book like Ben Sira, you have the Maccabees. I'll give you another example. Somebody recently gave me a gift, a 200-year-old book of Josephus, but it's not written in English. I don't understand a word that's in there. But it's Josephus. Now, Josephus is not a work of Torah. Josephus is people wonder, are these documents of value to Judaism? I guess somewhat. Josephus was like the news reporter of his time. He was reporting on the events of the temple's destruction and everything that was going on at that time. But going back to these works that were ancient Jewish works that are not part of the greater inclusion of Jewish writings, right, of like Torah, of the 24 books of Torah. There's only 24 books of Torah. And these other works were not canonized, were not included in the spectrum of Judaism. So other books include the book of Yehudit, Judith, the book of Enoch, Hanoch, the book of Jubilees, not spelled Jubilees, but it's not part of the Judaism. There's the book of Shoshana, which I think they call it Susanna in English. And then the book of Baruch. Any others? I think those are some of those that I found. There's probably others, but Josephus is different because Josephus is history. These are books of philosophy that were written by ancient Jewish personalities in the time, you could say in the biblical era, but yet they're not included in Tanakh. So how did it come that you have certain texts that were included in Tanakh, the 24 books of the Torah, right? The 5 books of Moses, the books of the prophets, and the books of the scriptures. And these were not canonized, were not included. Now, who decided what's included, what's not, was the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Agdola. We're talking about probably the beginning of the Second Temple era. That's probably when it was. And there were many great scholars and leaders at that time, such as Ezra HaSofer, Ezra the scribe, and Nehemiah, and the great prophets of that period, which was sort of the end of prophecy. So the prophets back then were Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. But once they passed, once they were no longer here, they canonized. They were the ones who decided what's included in Tanakh. And after that, all later works were simply not considered divinely inspired. And therefore, they weren't included in the official Jewish canon of Tanakh. Now, we have the oral law, which is Mishnah and Gemara, the Talmud, right? All that. And Halacha, many, many great works. Like we said, Judaism. I was telling you, I watched Jeff Bezos last night. And he was describing how in 1994, he already cataloged something like 4 million books that were in print at the time. If you look at just Jewish literature alone, we probably have hundreds of thousands of works, right? But they're not part of Tanakh. They're not part of Jewish scripture. So what was and what wasn't included if these works were already around then, right? We're not talking about books that came out much later, right? The Mishnah only came out probably a good 600 years later. The Mishnah was published around the year 200 of the Common Era. Whereas Tanakh was finalized and sealed as the 24 books of the Torah about 400 something years earlier. Okay, I'm not giving you exact numbers and dates today, but just as the numbers are in my head. And yet there were many other Jewish works available then, and they were not included in the Tanakh. So that's what they call the Apocrypha. Those are the books that were cast aside. They were not included. So do we see these works as forbidden? Why were they rejected? Or is there some value to them? Now, that the Torah approach to these works is quite complicated. And we see what's very interesting is what the Gemara says about it. Here's something in Tractate Sanhedrin. It says the sages said that the works of heretics, such as the book of Ben Sira, are forbidden. Now, Ben Sira, which is one of these books that I mentioned that's part of this Apocrypha, is considered a heretical work. I could read to you the Talmudic quote. The Gemara asks, where does it come from that people say a bad palm tree goes to be among a grove of barren trees? What is that question? The Talmud explains this is a reference to that people seek their same type, right? Tell me who your friends are, I'll tell you who you are. Or that, bad people look for bad neighbors, and therefore we're warned against having bad neighbors. And certainly, very interestingly, and why I came across this, I was reading letters of the Rebbe the other day, just flipping through some letters of the Rebbe. And it was an interesting letter he wrote to somebody in the 1960s. In the 1950s and 60s, there was major demographic changes going on in New York. And of course, I don't see the other side of the letter, so I can't say for certain. But what I understood was that this person was worried about his new neighbors. He got new black neighbors, and he was thinking, my goodness, I'm just thinking in my head what it was based on the Rebbe's response. His response to him was that good neighbors are not determined by their skin color. And he goes on to basically praise his own African neighbors, and then goes on to tell this person who wrote to him that stop judging people by their skin color or by their religion. Just because you're Jewish and your neighbor isn't, doesn't mean they're a bad neighbor. And just because you heard of a crime from somebody from a particular community committed, doesn't make all people from that community bad people. And he goes on in that letter, beautifully written, basically saying that you should engage your neighbors and you should cultivate a relationship. You should be the good neighbor, and you'll see how your neighbor is also good, and bring out the best and be a positive influence. It was a really beautiful letter that he was telling. But what's interesting is the Talmud is saying here, based on a verse in Ben Sira, that bad people seek out bad neighbors. And it gives you two quotes. One is from the Torah, which is that Esav went to Ishmael. So the fact that Esav went to Ishmael is, they're using, the Talmud is saying, you see that Esav, who was the bad son of Isaac, went to Ishmael, who was the bad son of Avraham. And then it quotes a verse and says, another verse is actually from Tanakh, the verse about Yiftach. Yiftach, if you recall, we'll read his Haftarah in a few weeks' time, and maybe it's worth a discussion. I'm not sure which week it is. I'll double check. It's around this time of the year that we read the Haftarah of Yiftach. Yiftach was a very great general in the Jewish military in the times when the Jews first settled in Israel. This is, I think, long before the first temple's even built. And he was the illegitimate son of his parents, and therefore he was not very well honored, and it wasn't treated that well by his family. Mm-hmm. And yet Yiftach turned out to be a great, great general, but he made one terrible mistake. And that was where he offered his daughter as a sacrifice. Okay, we'll get to that another time if you want to really analyze that story, if you like biblical stories, which we can learn lessons from. And I always repeat the fact that the Torah includes these stories in the Torah, the fact that these stories are not hidden, we don't shy away from them. What does that tell us? That tells us that there are lessons and messages we're to learn from. We can't click the delete button on something in our history that we don't like. But we can learn from those incidents. Another famous story that comes to mind is the story of Pelegash Begibon, the concubine in Gibon. Now, this isn't the story, you think about a guy who's traveling with his concubine. That's an extramarital relationship. The story is recorded in the Torah. Yet his concubine was raped by fellow Jewish people in the region of Benjamin, and unfortunately, and then she was murdered. And what this man did was he sliced his concubine into 12 pieces and sent one to each tribe to tell them, look what the people in the tribe of Benjamin, in the region of Benjamin, have done. And why is this story included? This story certainly doesn't speak very highly of our history, that we had people in the Jewish community who were capable of such despicable behavior. But the reason it's included is because there are lessons that have to come from it. In fact, the judges of that time said to themselves they were at fault. They accepted the blame. They said, you know how such an incident can happen? Because we, the judges, are sitting in our ivory towers and we're judging the people from afar. A judge should be a role model, should set the example. The judge should be traveling amongst the population and teaching people. And that's what they did. So all these stories in Tanakh are there to learn from. I digress. I was going to tell you, the Gemara quotes a verse from the book of Ben Sira. Ben Sira, we said, is one of those works that's forbidden. If you want to know the exact verse, it says, all fowl lives with its kind, and all men with those like them. So that's, again, a verse that's from the book of Ben Sira. And yet, if Ben Sira is considered the Apocrypha, those works that were forbidden to study, then how could the Talmud quote it? Is that not a contradiction? Is Ben Sira tantamount to history, as to heresy, as we said a second ago? Or is it a source that we view as authoritative and we quote it? Which way is it? So, the Talmud tells us itself that sometimes it's appropriate to look at those texts and understand what they say. So, it's interesting. It's not a ban on learning them or reading them per se. That's perhaps one way of seeing it, especially if you need to be familiar with these texts to know how to debate, how to argue with an apostate, with a heretic. But other commentators I saw take the approach that it's forbidden to read these works. But it was mostly in the earlier generations, the time when it was written, because these works were written in the same style as the Torah. They were written like scriptures, like Tanakh. And therefore, there were concerns that people would mistake them as part of Tanakh. But either way, even though the Talmud found some kind of room to quote these books, certainly, firstly, we don't have a lot of these works today. Only a handful of them have really survived through. I don't know which is the Book of Jubilee. I'm assuming the person could Google it, but I haven't done that myself. I haven't gone out there to try to find what it says in these books, especially since we're being told that these books are considered Sfarim Chitzanim. Again, they're not necessarily bad, but they certainly were not included in the canon of Jewish scripture. Now, and today, according to what I was reading, a lot of the translation of those books are not reliable today, and we don't have the original works, although some of them were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Something to do on our trip to Israel. I found that a fascinating experience going to the place where the Dead Sea Scrolls was found. What's the name of that area? Skips my head. Anyways, the problem with some of these works was that they contradict the teachings of Judaism.
Rabbi, excuse me interrupting.
So maybe they're valuable, but some of these works have concepts in them that are direct contradiction with accepted Jewish law. For example, in the book of Shoshana, Susanna, as they call it in English, in the book of Shoshana, it includes false information about the laws of Eidim Zomimim. Eidim Zomimim is false witnesses. We were learning that, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, that if a person accuses somebody, for example, in Jewish law, we say that a court will never convict anybody without two valid kosher witnesses. We discussed in great detail what's a kosher witness, and obviously if somebody's related to, whether it's the defendant or any of the litigants, then they're not a kosher qualified witness. We also discussed what else is not considered a qualified witness: a gambler, a thief, a convicted thief. So, if a person was proven to be not, qualified, a good kosher witness, but then was proven to have testified falsely against somebody, then what's the law? The accepted law is whatever the conviction would be against the person whom they testified against, that would happen to this individual. If it's a death penalty, the false witness will receive capital punishment. If it was a penalty, then whatever the penalty might be, that goes to that person. So that's the law, yet in the book of Susanna, there's a contradiction to that. Whereas in the book of Chanoch and Jubilees, it portrays the relationship between God, angels, and humans as in ways that are, again, also antithetical to the Jewish perspective. So aside from being unreliable, and also, as we said, they're not divinely inspired, these works are openly contradicting our tradition. So we reject them as heresy. Other books are maybe not holy, but there's nothing wrong with them. The fact that they're not included in Tanakh is just because they're not part of Jewish scriptures. So you take the book of Maccabees as an example, and there's multiple volumes. It's the story of Hanukkah. Okay, now Hanukkah happened after the Tanakh was completed, so it's not included in there. You want to read the book of Maccabees? Hey, we read it. We know the story of Hanukkah from there. It's at great length, as well as the book of Judith. So maybe they're not divinely inspired because prophecy was considered to have already long ceased by then. But you want to read it as a book of history? Perfectly fine. So the point is, not all ancient books, even if they're Jewish, are forbidden. Going back to the book of Ben Sira, I think they call it in English something like Ecclesiasticus, whereas Kohelet is Ecclesiastes. This is Ecclesiasticus. So the Talmud itself quotes it a few times. What does that tell us? That, there's some references in it. And in fact, Ben Sira, the author, he himself is, I think, where's he quoted? Maybe it's in Pirkei Avos or somewhere he's quoted. Okay, he was considered one of the men of the Great Assembly. So if the Talmud is quoting him, then perhaps there are valuable messages within the book. Okay, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly, were the great holy sages who themselves. Okay, now Ben Sira, if it was around then, if he was a member of the assembly, and they didn't include his work, so why didn't they include it? Either it's not part of the Torah's message, or maybe because, as the Talmud found, heretical messages in it. But the fact that the Talmud does quote it certainly implies that it has value. And therefore, it's, there's some, it's not considered, I guess, idol worship. And therefore, it's part of what is included and what's allowed. I want to conclude today with something more, I want to call it contemporary, but something that's more recent, okay? So let me just give you the three categories first. Okay, first of all, we need to have a nuanced approach in general to the teachings, to these works. And as one of the sages here says, that there are appropriate times when to study them. And like I said, for example, one who wants to know how to answer a heretic. Just a few more points here. There are books that are translations of translations, and therefore those are not reliable. Works that are contradictory or antithetical to Judaism that were mentioned. And then books like Ben Sira that do have some value to them. But to conclude today, I want to share with you a story. We'll call it the Tale of Two Presses. And it's not only reading forbidden works that we talk about. So, for example, Rambam, we said, made an exception because he needs to know how to deal with heretics. But there are other instances of Jewish works that were also controversial that I thought was worthwhile to share with you. And one of them is a famous incident in the early 19th century. The mere printing of heretical works became a major debate and a dispute, a conflict in the Jewish community. And it all revolved around these two printing houses. Talking about some 150, 200 years ago. What am I saying? It was the time of the Alter Rebbe. They published the Tanya. Okay, let me give you a little bit of background. Back, especially in Eastern Europe, you could see on Netflix these days, there's some series about what life was like under the Tsar. The Tsars just enriched themselves, and the rest of the population was sort of just left to their own vices. But there was a major influence there from the Catholic Church. And that was that they had censors in Jewish printing houses. If there was anything that they felt that was heretical from their perspective, or that was offensive to the church, they censored it. And they had censors reading through the works. So if there was anything, for example, even the Talmud says in it things that are offensive to Christians. Most of that was actually completely censored out of the Talmud. Now you think of those days, publishing was expensive, and you have a person who's doing this for a living. They needed to watch their costs and their situations. They probably had to pay the censor, just to get the approval to print their works. So there was a town in Ukraine called Slavita. I don't know if they had a major population there. I think there were, several thousand people who worked there or lived there. It was a Jewish community. And in fact, there's a very famous publishing house from Slavita, which was called the Slavita Publishing House, run by the Slavita brothers. And they published a lot of Jewish works in that time. I'm talking about a good 200 years ago, the time when the Alter Rebbe published the Tanya, because they were the ones who published. I think they were the ones that published the first Tanya. So at that stage, the rabbi in Slavita, his name was Moshe Shapiro, and his family owned this publishing house. He wanted to he wanted Jewish books to be published and promulgated and sent, and that Jews could have more books to read. Especially at the time, was a great era of Jewish publication. You're talking about just after the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid and the Vilna Gaon, many great luminaries of Jewish life at the time. So this printing house that was established by Rabbi Moshe Shapiro, he was the founder of this printing house. And initially his purpose was, his father was a great Rebbe, was Reb Pinchas Karitzer, was a great Hasidic Rebbe, was a follower of the Maggid of Mezrich. So initially his purpose was to print those works that we mentioned. That was the initial purpose, but obviously you need to make a living. So he published other books as well. And in fact, he became very famous for publishing an edition of the Talmud, because it wasn't just the publication of it, it was also the layout, the typeset. And he gave his work, he passed on late 18th century. His sons, two sons, Reb Shmuel Abba and Reb Pinchas, they were known as the Shapiro brothers of the Slavita printing press, and they were the operators of this business. It was a major operation to think about what printing was like then. Have you ever gone into printing press? Today, it's a different world of what it was 20 years ago. I had a newspaper in the mid-1990s, and I remember what it was like then to print, to publish. I would first work on my computer at home and make my, typeset and layout. Then we would go into the dark room in the printing press and create metal plates. Today, it's all done. I think then they called it web printing or something. Today, it's all done electronically. It's digital. Whatever graphics I make on my computer, I send it off to a printer. I could do it right here in my office. Talking about 25 years ago, we had to have plates, metal plates. I have all those metal plates still sitting in my parents' basement. Imagine what it was like 200 years ago, operating a printing press. So they published a very famous printing of the Talmud, talking about early 1800s. And it had many approbations, many people who endorsed their publication. Okay, just because of the beautiful way they laid out the pages. And I think that's the way all Talmud books today follow that layout. Because if you look at ancient books of Talmud, there were probably other ways it was laid out. They did it in their way, in their style. And I think it was also colorful. They had like a red text and different fonts that they used. And most of the printing houses today follow that, and that's like become the traditional standard way. Do I have a book of Talmud with me here? I don't have one in my office. What a shame. So I would have shown it to you, and I should have put it into the slides. But after a couple of years, despite the cost of printing as it was then, their storerooms were completely sold out of the Talmud. People brought, copies were flying. People were buying them left and right. Many shuls bought copies. And what's interesting is somebody, in fact, brought here into Chabad House last week a book of Talmud, a really old one, over 100 years old. He gave it to me as a gift. The only problem is one of my colleagues was looking through it and said, see, it has a stamp of a shul. So it belongs to one of the local shuls, and we obviously have to give it to the shul. This person was moving overseas and gave me a gift of a bunch of books that I had to bring to Sheamus, and there was this book of Talmud included in it, which was interesting to me that he, it looks very similar to the way they are today. Sorry, Rosalind, you have a question. I apologize, I didn't notice the message.
Problem. I was asking, were the Dead Sea Scrolls not found in Qumran?
Rosalind, you had a question?
I asked if the Dead Sea Scrolls...
Time is also running, so I'm going to try to conclude. I didn't even get to the point I wanted to make about this conflict of the brothers. Let me get to the gist of it. They sold out of their Talmud. They did a second printing and a third printing, and it was flying like hotcakes. And even though they were Hasidic people, everyone enjoyed it. Even the Misnagdim, the Hasidically challenged Jews of the time, enjoyed their printing of the Talmud. They were just considered like really, really from the top. Rosalind asked about Dead Sea. I muted myself. Yeah, my apologies, guys. I couldn't hear it. This happens over and over. I turned off the volume on my computer before. Okay, because I was getting feedback when I did the video. Apologies. Go ahead. What were you going to ask?
Dead Sea Scrolls, were they not found in Qumran?
Yes, in Qumran. That's right. Qumran. That's right. And the name came to me a second ago. Qumran. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. So we're going to have to do a world tour one day. We're going to go to Ukraine and go to Slavita and see where this printing press was and experience that. And Qumran, that's right. Qumran is the place where they were printed. Okay, I apologize that I didn't hear. I turned my volume off. Sorry, you could be talking and nobody hears me. Okay. What else is interesting is that there was a copyright, a Jewish copyright. I don't know when copyrights came into the public sphere, but the Jewish copyrights existed for a long time. So there was competition that wanted to print the Talmud, and the rabbis at the time forbade the competition from printing it because of their copyright. It's another interesting story which I won't go into right now. And that was because there was another publishing house in Vilna, which was the Ram brothers. If you look in some of the other, in fact, when the Slavita printing press shut down, which sadly happened after an incident that I'll tell you in a moment, the Talmud was printed instead by the Ram brothers. And in fact, most versions of the Talmud that we have today, up until the Second World War, you could see the Lithuanian edition. It says Ha'achim v'hamana Ram, which means the brothers and widow Ram, because I think there were 3 brothers, and one of them died, but his wife succeeded him as a partner in the company. So they called it the brothers because there were 2 surviving brothers, and the widow of the brother who died. So that was their business, and they were the competition. Very interesting story, again, for another time. There's never enough time in a day, right? But I just have a few more minutes to share with you. But that competition, that's what I wanted to say. There were the 2 printing houses, one in Slavita, which is Ukraine, and the other was the Ram brothers in Lithuania, in Vilna. And there was a major controversy at the time. The competition caused controversy, which was, what can I say? Competition is sometimes good, but firstly, it crossed geographical borders because they were both Eastern Europe, but they were different places. But the question was, many rabbis supported the printers of the Slavita brothers because they were They were the original typesetters of the Talmud, and now you have the Ram brothers who are copying their copyright. So that was a very interesting dispute at the time, and it was a very heated dispute, and accusations were flying. For example, Rabbi Akiva Eger, very famous Talmudic commentator who lived in the 1800s, he wrote that he favored. He was saying that there was favoritism, and that's again in this week's parsha, because there was bribery. It was a very sad story that happened. There was they claimed that there was bribery and corruption of the censors, and it was a very sad quarrel, and sadly it came to an end where the brothers were accused of murdering one of their employees. It was a fellow Jew. He was a bookbinder that worked for them, but he was a shtickle alcoholic. His name was Eliezer. He liked some nice strong drinks, and he was very intoxicated. And one day he was found hanging inside the printing press. Okay, most likely it was a suicide. Okay, that's why he was hanging there. But when the police were called in, they were suspected of murdering him. And in fact, there was a claim that again, one could read up on it more, stemming from the competition. That these guys they didn't approve of this drunkard's beliefs. That he was part of the censorship, and they didn't like what his opinion was, so they murdered him. This was an accusation against them, which ultimately was proven wrong. I'm assuming, with post-mortems, they were able to prove that it was a suicide. But sadly, the Shapiro brothers of the Slavita printing press went through a horrendous punishment, and they were eventually sent off to Siberia. At the time, they were put through a punishment, and one of the brothers, his yarmulke fell off, where they were being hit, they were being whipped. And when his yarmulke fell off, he refused to continue until the yarmulke was back on his head. So that's part of the stories that happened at the time. Crazy, crazy stories of what Jewish people went through in those days. The reason I wanted to mention them was because when they were imprisoned, they snuck in with them a little Torah scroll. I think they actually wrote the Torah scroll in that time. And that's a Torah scroll that the Rebbe was given as a gift. So if any of you have ever been to 770, you could see that Torah scroll. But anyways, I think I've passed my time for today. There's a lot more to the story that I wanted to share with you. I guess I'll have to share the remainder of the story another time. The bottom line, what's the bottom line of everything we discussed today? I gave you some history, but the bottom line of everything we talked about is the self-sacrifice, I think, that people had for Torah and for having our own printing presses, that the right works were printed. I think that inspires us that the commitment to our Jewish way of life without the infiltration of other idolatrous and pagan ways. To be continued, ladies and gents. Gotta go. We have a meeting coming up in 4 minutes, so with that, I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you for joining me here today. Tomorrow, please God, it's the yahrzeit of the Rebbe's father. And therefore, tomorrow's share, I hope to share with you some insights, some history, and different things about the story of the Rebbe's father. So please God, join me here tomorrow. It's called Chaf Ab, that's the date in the calendar, and I'll share with you some more interesting insights about his life and his teachings and his legacy in tomorrow's class right here. All the best, everyone.